millions of people around the world share a strange secret. The moment they step outside and look up at a bright sun, something happens inside their body that they cannot control. Their nose tingles, their eyes water, and within a second or two, they sneeze, not once, sometimes 2 or 3 times in a row. It happens every single time they face bright light, and for most of their life they had no idea why. For decades, doctors brushed this off as a strange personal quirk. Some called it an allergy. Some blamed dust. Some told people it was just a coincidence. But scientists who finally studied this reaction across thousands of families discovered something nobody expected. This sneeze is not random at all. It is written directly into human DNA, passed down from parent to child like eye color or height, and the story behind it stretches back further than anyone imagined. If you are one of the people who sneezes at sunlight, stick around, because what researchers found about this reflex will change the way you think about your own body. And if you have never experienced it, you're about to learn why nearly 1 in every 4 people on this planet lives with a genetic switch that you don't have. Let's start with what actually happens in the body during this reaction. Scientists gave this condition a proper medical name. They call it the Photic Sneeze Reflex. Some researchers nicknamed it ACHOO Syndrome, which stands for Autosomal Dominant Compelling Helio-Ophthalmic Outburst. That long name basically means a sneeze triggered by looking at the sun, and the word autosomal dominant is the key part, because it tells us this trait is inherited in a very specific and powerful way. When light suddenly hits the eyes, especially strong sunlight after being indoors or in shade, the pupils rapidly shrink to protect the retina from the burst of brightness. In most people, that is the end of the story. The eyes adjust, and nothing else happens. But in people who carry this genetic trait, the signal sent to shrink the pupils appears to spill over into a completely different nerve pathway, one that is normally responsible for detecting irritation inside the nose. The brain receives a mixed signal, almost like a wrong number being dialed inside the nervous system, and it reacts the only way it knows how when it thinks the nose has been irritated. It triggers a sneeze. This entire process happens in a fraction of a second, and the person experiencing it has zero control over it. You cannot think your way out of it. You cannot hold it back through willpower. The moment enough bright light hits the eyes, the sneeze fires automatically, like a reflex hammer tapping your knee and making your leg kick. Researchers wanted to know exactly how common this was, so they ran surveys and genetic studies across many different populations. The numbers were surprising. Estimates range from about 18% to as high as 35% of people experiencing this reflex, depending on the population studied. That means in almost any group of 4 or 5 people, there is a strong chance at least one of them sneezes at bright light without ever fully understanding why. Now here is where the story gets interesting, because scientists didn't stop at just describing the reflex. They wanted to know if it was truly genetic or if it was some kind of learned habit or environmental coincidence. To test this, they turned to family studies, twin studies, and eventually large-scale genetic databases containing DNA from hundreds of thousands of volunteers. The family studies were the first big clue. Researchers noticed that photic sneezing tended to run in families with a very clear and predictable pattern. If one parent had the trait, there was roughly a 50% chance that each of their children would have it too. That 50% number is the exact signature of what geneticists call an autosomal dominant trait, meaning you only need to inherit the gene variant from one parent, not both, for the trait to show up in you. This is the same basic inheritance pattern seen in traits like a cleft chin or certain forms of curly hair, where a single copy of a gene variant is enough to switch the trait on. Twin studies added even more weight to the genetic argument. When researchers compared identical twins, who share nearly all of their DNA, against fraternal twins, who share only about half like regular siblings, the pattern was striking. Identical twins were far more likely to both share the photic sneeze reflex or both lack it entirely. Fraternal twins showed much more mixed results, with one twin sometimes having the trait and the other not having it at all. This is exactly the kind of evidence geneticists look for when trying to prove that biology, not environment or upbringing, is driving a trait. But the discovery that truly confirmed everything came from large-scale genome-wide association studies. These studies work by scanning the entire genetic code of huge groups of volunteers and comparing people who report a certain trait against people who do not, searching for any tiny genetic differences that consistently show up in one group but not the other. One of the largest studies of this kind involved data from a genetics and ancestry company that had access to genetic information from hundreds of thousands of customers who had also answered lifestyle survey questions, including whether they sneeze when exposed to bright light. When researchers ran the comparison, they found specific locations on the human genome that were strongly linked to the photic sneeze reflex. 2 regions stood out most clearly. One sits near a gene involved in the development and function of the eye, and the other sits near a gene connected to how nerve cells communicate with each other in the brain. This finding made perfect biological sense. It supported the idea that the reflex comes from a kind of accidental cross-wiring between the visual system and the nerve pathways controlling sneezing, exactly what scientists had suspected based on family patterns for years, now finally confirmed at the level of actual DNA sequences. This was a huge moment for a trait that had been dismissed as a minor curiosity for so long. For the first time, scientists could point to specific stretches of genetic code and say, this is very likely part of the reason some people sneeze at the sun and others never do. Once the genetics were confirmed, researchers turned to a much bigger question. Why would evolution ever produce a trait like this in the first place? At first glance, sneezing uncontrollably every time you step into bright light doesn't sound like it would help anyone survive. If anything, it seems like a strange and useless side effect. But nature rarely keeps traits around for millions of years without some kind of reason, even if that reason is subtle or indirect. Several theories have been proposed, and while scientists have not settled on one single definite answer, each theory offers a fascinating window into how our nervous system evolved. The first theory suggests that the photic sneeze reflex may simply be a harmless byproduct of how densely packed our nerve pathways are inside the skull. The nerve responsible for vision and the nerve responsible for sensations in the face and nose sit extremely close to each other as they travel from the eyes and nose toward the brainstem. In people with this trait, there may be a slightly unusual pattern of nerve wiring, where a strong signal in one pathway leaks just enough electrical activity into the neighboring pathway to trigger a sneeze. Under this theory, the reflex isn't something evolution deliberately built for a purpose. It is simply a side effect of packing so many nerves into a small space, a bit like static crossing over between two wires running too close together. A second theory takes a more functional approach, suggesting the reflex might have offered a small protective benefit long ago. When the eyes suddenly encounter overwhelming brightness, the pupils constrict rapidly. Some researchers propose that a sneeze occurring at the same moment could help clear the nasal passages of any irritants at a time when the eyes are momentarily less able to detect airborne threats, since intense light exposure temporarily narrows visual sensitivity. In this view, the sneeze isn't useless at all. It might be an ancient multitasking reflex, using one strong sensory trigger to prompt a second protective action in a nearby part of the body. A third theory looks at how our ancestors lived before modern shelter and clothing existed. Early humans spent enormous amounts of time outdoors, moving between shaded forests, caves, and open sunlit plains. Every time they stepped from dim shade into strong sunlight, their pupils had to adjust rapidly and repeatedly throughout the day. Some scientists suggest that in this environment, a sneeze reflex tied to sudden brightness could have helped clear dust, pollen, or small particles that tend to build up in shaded, enclosed spaces like caves or dense brush, right at the exact moment early humans emerged into open air. Under this theory, the trait may have offered just enough of a minor advantage in an outdoor survival environment to stick around and get passed down, even if it looks unnecessary in our modern world of indoor lighting and climate-controlled buildings. None of these theories have been proven as the single definitive explanation, and researchers are honest about that uncertainty. But together, they paint a picture of a trait that likely began as a harmless quirk of nerve wiring and may have picked up a small functional benefit along the way, enough to survive hundreds of thousands of years of human evolution without being selected against. What makes this discovery even more interesting is that the photic sneeze reflex is not the only case of this kind of nervous system cross-wiring in the human body. Scientists have identified several other reflexes where one sensory trigger unexpectedly sets off a completely different physical reaction, and studying these side by side has helped researchers understand the photic sneeze reflex even better. One well-known example is the connection between a full stomach and sneezing. A small percentage of people report sneezing multiple times in a row shortly after eating a large meal, a pattern researchers have started referring to as a snatiation reflex. Just like the sun sneeze, this trait appears to run in families and is believed to involve a similar kind of nerve signal overlap, this time between the nerves controlling stomach stretch and the nerves controlling the sneeze response. Another example involves the ear and the throat. Some people sneeze or cough uncontrollably the moment a cotton swab or a finger touches deep inside their ear canal. This happens because a nerve running through the ear canal shares a pathway with the nerve controlling throat and airway sensations, so stimulating one nerve triggers the response usually reserved for the other. Doctors sometimes call this Arnold's reflex, and it shows up during routine ear examinations more often than most people realize. Taken together, these overlapping reflexes suggest that the human nervous system, while incredibly advanced, is not a perfectly isolated set of separate wires. It is more like a densely packed bundle of pathways running extremely close to each other throughout the head and neck, and every so often, a strong enough signal in one pathway spills over and triggers a reaction somewhere else entirely. The photic sneeze reflex is simply the most common and most noticeable version of this phenomenon because sunlight is such an intense and frequent trigger for nearly everyone. Now, let's talk about who actually carries this trait because the genetic data revealed some interesting patterns across different groups of people. Studies suggest the trait appears in people of all ancestries and backgrounds, with no single population being immune to it and no single population having it universally. However, some large surveys have found slightly different rates when comparing broad ancestral groups, though researchers are careful to point out that these differences are likely influenced by how survey questions were asked and how comfortable people felt reporting an unusual bodily reaction rather than representing a dramatic biological divide between populations. What researchers are far more confident about is the family pattern. If you sneeze at sunlight, look at your parents. There's a very strong chance one of them does too, even if they never talked about it or never realized it was anything more than a random personal habit. And if you have children, there is roughly a 50% chance each of them will inherit the same trait from you, thanks to that classic autosomal dominant inheritance pattern researchers confirmed through years of family and twin studies. There is also a practical side to this discovery that goes beyond simple curiosity. Understanding the photic sneeze reflex actually matters in real-world situations, especially for pilots, drivers, and people operating heavy machinery. A sudden, uncontrollable sneeze triggered by glare from the sun, especially while driving directly into low sunlight at sunrise or sunset, can briefly take a person's eyes off the road, or controls at exactly the wrong moment. Because of this, some aviation and safety researchers have specifically studied the reflex to better understand who might be affected and how quickly the reaction occurs, so that appropriate precautions like sunglasses or visors can be recommended to people who know they carry the trait. Doctors have also found this reflex useful in an unexpected medical context. During certain eye examinations and procedures, particularly ones involving bright lights shown directly into the eyes, physicians now know to warn patients in advance that they may suddenly sneeze. Without that warning, patients have been startled by their own sudden unexpected reaction, sometimes even jerking their head at an inconvenient moment during a delicate procedure. What used to seem like a strange and unpredictable interruption is now understood as a completely normal, genetically predictable event for a significant portion of the population. So what does all of this really tell us? It tells us that even the smallest, strangest habits our bodies produce often have a real, traceable biological explanation hiding underneath them. For a long time, people who sneezed at the sun assumed there was something slightly odd or unique about them personally. Some were even teased about it as children, told they were imagining things or being dramatic. But the genetic research proved that this reaction is not imagination, not allergy, and not a coincidence. It is a real inherited trait, linked to specific regions of the human genome, passed down through generations exactly like eye color, height, or the shape of your smile. It also tells us something bigger about how the human body actually works. We like to imagine our nervous system as a perfectly organized network, each nerve doing exactly one job with no interference from anything else. But the truth is messier and far more interesting. Nerves run close together, signals occasionally overlap. And sometimes one sensory experience accidentally triggers a completely different physical response, creating quirks like a sneeze at sunlight, a sneeze after a big meal, or a sneeze triggered by cleaning your ear. These aren't malfunctions. They are simply glimpses into how densely wired and interconnected our biology really is. The next time you or someone you know steps outside into bright sunshine and lets out a sudden sneeze, you will know exactly what is happening. Somewhere deep inside the nervous system, a signal meant only for the eyes is spilling over into the pathway controlling the nose, a tiny genetic quirk passed down from a parent, encoded in specific stretches of DNA, shaped by millions of years of human evolution, and now finally understood thanks to modern genetic research. It is a small reminder that even the strangest, most overlooked habits of the human body are rarely random. They are written into who we are long before we are ever born, waiting quietly in our DNA until the sun comes out and switches them on.